Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. Today's topic of conversation is organization of the human body. In this discussion, we're going to be looking at the different organs within the body and where they can be found, how they're protected, and how they're able to perform some of their movements and functions while remaining safe. The first thing we're going to be talking about today are body cavities. Body cavities are holes found in the body, which kind of relates to the cavities we might be a little bit more familiar with, the ones in our teeth. Now, the ones in our teeth, obviously, those are not good. We need to go to a dentist and get those taken care of. But the holes in our body are quite good. They allow our organs to move and function within a safe environment. Some of these holes are found in the axial portion of the body. Actually, most of them are. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about with the axial portion of the body, I am specifically talking about the region of the head, the neck, and then the trunk, which would essentially be from our shoulders down to the bottom of our pelvis. In contrast to the axial portion of our body, we do have the appendicular portion, which is referencing the upper and lower limbs, or the upper arms and the lower legs, if you will. This image illustrates what exactly I mean by the axial and appendicular portions. We can see the axial is highlighted using blue, so that does include our head, the neck, and then our trunk, whereas the appendicular, illustrated in pink, includes the arms as well as the legs. Now, this is known as appendicular because our arms and legs are also known as what are called appendages. So now that we know about the axial and appendicular divisions of our body, we're going to be looking at the body cavities, which are located in that axial division. You're going to need to pencil these in on the handout you've been provided, which is very similar to this one. We're going to start at the top and kind of work our way down. So up at the top in our head, we have the cranial cavity, protecting our brain. We have the vertebral cavity, which is where our spinal cord is found. We have our chest region of the axial body, and centrally located in our chest we have two different regions. They are both part of a place known as the mediastinum. The top one here, known as the superior mediastinum, that's where our windpipe goes down into our chest and branches off into two tubes. One tube goes to each lung as we inhale or exhale air. The inferior or lower region of the mediastinum contains the heart and a body cavity known as the pericardial cavity. And then we do have two lungs. The two lungs are separated, so we have two cavities, one for each lung. We call those cavities the pleural cavities, which kind of implies by name that there are two of them, one on each side of the mediastinum, one for each lung. Now the chest region, the mediastinum and pleural cavities, along with the pericardial cavity, collectively are known as one larger body cavity, the thoracic cavity. So all of these are included in this larger, more inclusive body cavity. Beneath our chest, in our stomach region, we have what is known as the Abdominopelvic cavity. As the name implies, it is a combination of the abdominal cavity as well as the pelvic cavity. You can see our abdominal cavity is more of our tummy region, and our pelvic cavity is much lower. We can see our hip bones on either side there. Now, what separates the thoracic cavity, the chest, from the abdominal pelvic cavity below the chest is a muscle known as the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that we use to breathe. The muscle pulls down, which draws air in through our mouths and into each lung. We'll talk more about the mechanism of breathing during second semester. Collectively, all of the cavities within the body, excluding the neck and head, are part of the ventral body cavity. So there's one big division of the body known as the ventral body cavity, which extends from the thoracic down to the abdominal pelvic floor. Turning this image to the side now, We no longer see ventral body cavities. We talked about that. That includes the thoracic cavity as well as the abdominal and pelvic cavity. So those are all part of the ventral body cavities. We have a different type of cavity, which the cranial cavity and vertebral cavity belong to, known as the dorsal body cavity. And we'll be talking about differences between the dorsal body cavity and ventral body cavity shortly. So now that we've labeled and talked about some of the body cavities, what is their job? Why do we have holes in our body? Well, we need a place to put organs, and we can't put them anywhere if there is no space. So these holes kind of create that space, as well as provide protection to the organs. We'll elaborate on what I mean by protection in the slides that follow. This chart kind of gives us a breakdown of body cavities in general. There are two main divisions. We spoke of the ventral body cavity within the chest and stomach region, the dorsal body cavity containing our brain as well as our spinal cord. The ventral body cavity is broken down into two smaller cavities, the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. The thoracic, once again, is part of our chest. The abdominopelvic is below our chest and into our pelvis region. Within our chest, the thoracic cavity has two smaller cavities. There is the pleural cavities, as well as the pericardial cavity, which makes up part of that mediastinum. And in our stomach, the abdominopelvic cavity is broken down into two smaller ones, the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. So those are all ventral body cavities. Well, what about dorsal body cavities? Now there's two. There's the cranial cavity for our brain and the spinal cavity for our spinal cord. We're going to be looking at both ventral and dorsal body cavities, but we're going to start with the ventral. Ventral contain viscera. Viscera are organs. It's a general name given to any organ in the trunk of the body. And many of these organs or viscera can change size and shape or move in position, like our large intestine, that can move. Our small intestines, those move. Our stomach does. Our lungs sure do, as well as our heart. But these other ones, they're able to be jostled around as well without much problem. You can kind of imagine what problems might arise if our brain gets jostled around. So our viscera are organs that can move or are allowed to move, or if they do get moved, there isn't really severe damage done to them. So ventral body cavities, as mentioned, most of them are allowed to move, and they do so involuntarily. Once again, involuntarily means they just do it on their own. Our small intestines, it has to move food through it, through the digestive process. We don't have to think about that happening. It just happens. And the viscera are surrounded by what are known as serous membranes. Serous membranes provides kind of like a fluid that allows these organs to move while receiving some form of lubrication so that they don't grind on one another, causing friction. You can imagine if you did not have fluid around your lungs every time you took a breath, it would feel like your lung is being scraped along some sandpaper, which would be quite painful. So these serous membranes allow these organs to move friction-free and prevent the development of holes or pain as they do so. Serous membranes produce serous fluid. That is the fluid that I just previously spoke of that prevents the friction between your lungs and the wall of your pleural cavities as you take in a breath of air. So we have a layer of wall on the cavity, and we have a layer of the lung that actually come into contact one another with this serous fluid in between the two. The parietal layer is the layer of the cavity that comes into contact with the lungs. And the outer layer of the lungs that comes into contact with the wall of the cavity is known as the visceral layer. And I have a picture on the next slide which will kind of help illustrate this point right here. We can see the parietal layer, we can see the pleural membrane right here. It's kind of cut and flapped back. This region right here is the parietal pleura, and this outer layer right here of the lung, which is kind of flat back. Actually, what my mouse cursor is on right now would be considered technically the visceral pleura. These two membranes come into contact with one another and do touch. They don't have any friction, though, because of that serous fluid. So looking at specifically the chest region of cavities, that is known collectively as the thoracic cavity. We talked about it being found in the chest. And these cavities are located behind the rib cage, and they start at our collarbone, and they extend down to the diaphragm. We can see them illustrated here in this picture. We can see the rib cage right here, and behind the rib cage we can see the two lungs, which are inside the pleural cavity, as well as the heart, which is right behind our breastbone, inside the pericardial cavity. Got a better image on the side over here with the ribs cut away. You can see the two lungs, the heart, which would be in the pericardial cavity, and then extending upwards to the superior mediastinum right up in this region right here. So starts at the collarbone, goes down to the diaphragm, which once again is a muscle that when it pulls downward, draws air into our lungs. So revisiting these pleural cavities, part of the thoracic cavity, there are two. There's the left and there's the right, one for each lung, and they are separate. They're separated by the mediastinum, and as mentioned, one in each lung. So here we can see a picture once again of that mediastinum. It is the space between the two pleural cavities, consisting of the lung, or the heart, the pericardial cavity, as well as the superior mediastinum. Additionally, with the pleural cavities, the serous membrane with the parietal as well as the visceral collectively is known as the parietal pleura, just in general. So with that in mind, we do have the visceral pleura as well as the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura would be the lining of the cavity. The visceral pleura would be the lining of the lungs. Also within the thoracic cavity is the pericardial cavity, which, as the name cardia suggests, it has associated with the heart, surrounds it. It also has a serous membrane between the heart and the cavity lining. This particular serous membrane is known as the pericardial membranes, and we have a visceral layer and a parietal layer to that. In this case, it would be the visceral pericardium. That would be the serous membrane that's lining the heart, and the parietal pericardium, which would be the layer lining the pericardial cavity. This colorway illustrates those two components. We have the parietal pericardium right here on the outside. This is taken from the little outer box right here, and then that would come into contact with the parietal pericardium, which is part of the cavity that encloses the heart. And then there would be fluid in between them. That would be a serous fluid known as the pericardial fluid. Touching on the abdominal pelvic cavity, this starts at the diaphragm, which is where the thoracic cavity ends, and it goes to the floor of the pelvis. And the serous membranes in this cavity are known as peritoneal membranes. So we would have a visceral and parietal layer to that. These ones are known as the visceral peritoneum and the parietal peritoneum. Visceral always refers to the organ, so this would be the lining on the organ, and parietal peritoneum, parietal's referring to the lining on the cavity, so we would have the lining on the cavity here. And breaking the abdominal pelvic into the respective abdominal and pelvic cavities, the abdominal extends from the diaphragm into the pelvis, and the organs you would find there would be the stomach, liver, spleen, gallbladder, and parts of the small and large intestines. The pelvic cavity is inferior or below the abdominal cavity, and it's found entirely within the pelvis, and protects some of the same organs as the abdominal cavity, parts of the large and small intestines, but we also have our urinary bladder and our reproductive organs as well. This image shows the locations of some of those organs. We can see most of the organs are up high, but we do have the pelvic cavity, which would be right in this region and below.